When was the last time you felt really happy? You were really celebrating something. Maybe it was a birthday or a wedding, or the birth of a child, or the birth of a grandchild, or a niece or a nephew. When was the last time you found joy in something? When you stopped and paused and looked and found joy in it. Maybe it was a beautiful sunset. We get some gorgeous sunsets on Mersey, or the sound of birds singing in your garden. Or perhaps just being able to go out for a walk and enjoying the feeling of the wind on your face. Perhaps even we find joy and happiness in being able to share a cup of tea or a coffee with somebody face to face, rather than via Zoom or FaceTiming or having to rely on technology to actually meet somebody again face to face and spend good time with them. When, though, was the last time you rejoiced in the Lord? To find joy in the Lord. And is it even possible, as in our reading, to always rejoice in the Lord? Is it possible to always rejoice? To always be joyful and happy and celebrating? It was so important to Paul in our reading that we do just that we rejoice always, that he says it twice. It's like he's underlining it in the reading. Rejoice in the Lord, and I say again, rejoice. Do we put the importance that Paul has put on rejoicing in the Lord? But there's so many things that stop us from being able to rejoice. There's so many things that steal our happiness. There's so many things that crowd in and squash out that which we find joy in. That actually joy becomes the opportunity to celebrate, to rejoice, becomes just a passing moment, a short period of time. Things such as our health, money, work, lack of money, injustice, family, too much work, maybe even too many family members being around, or not seeing family members, loneliness, overcrowding, expectations, our own expectations on ourselves and expectations that others have of us. All of these things kind of busy into our life and makes it really hard to find joy, to actually take time when we're on the walk to notice the beauty that might be in the tree that we've just walked past, or even to hear the sound of the birds because of the rushing traffic and the buses that are going past us. Time. Maybe we have too much time on our hands, or just not enough, and we're just too busy and a bit overstretched. Stress. The feeling of being put upon, all these things come in and steal our joy and take away that which we feel we wish we had. The ability to rejoice in the Lord always. Joy is often short-lived, fleeting, and attached to an emotion. It's kept for special occasions. And we wonder sometimes, when was the last time we really laughed, really laughed, and were filled with joy and rejoiced about the situation we find ourselves in? And I know you're thinking, but in our reading, it's a different setting, it's a different time. When Paul is writing this, he's writing to a different church. He's not living now. He's not appreciating my life, my current situation. It is impossible to be rejoicing at all times and in all ways. And actually circumstances, like I've just said, steal it all. But what is it that Paul really means when he's saying, rejoice in the Lord always? And I say again, rejoice. What is Paul talking about? So let's just take a look at the time that when Paul wrote this setting in which Paul himself was in. So we find Paul at this letter. He's written to the church in Philippi, and it's a church that Paul actually helped to set up and establish, and it's one of his missionary churches, and he's got a good relationship, and they must have been writing backwards and forwards, but we've just got this one letter, this glimpse into this relationship, and we discover that Paul is actually in prison, not a place of rejoicing, and he's in a Roman prison. Prisons then are very different to prisons now. Prisons then didn't bother to provide the essentials. They locked you up, but you didn't get food. That was dependent on you to sort out as a prisoner, or for your friends and relatives to provide. And so actually the church in Philippians, they send someone to Paul to help look after Paul, to be there for Paul, to be his helper, to bring in the things from outside of the prison that he might need, like food. But this friend falls ill, and so actually Paul is sending him back to the Philippians and saying thank you, but he's been really ill, and now I'm sending him back to you. And it was all really touch and go as to whether he was going to live or not. So the situation isn't actually, when you actually sit and look at this situation that Paul is in, you wouldn't sit and go, wow, that's a great place to be. I can understand why Paul is rejoicing. And when you read further, you discover actually Paul in his letter says, I don't know if I'm going to live or die. I don't know what the outcome is of my court case that's still to be decided, whether they're going to set me free or whether I'm going to be executed. I don't know. But Paul is still rejoicing in this place of complete uncertainty. Paul is still rejoicing in the Lord. He is still able to hold on to it and find something to celebrate, to find joy in what, if I was completely honest, if I was sat in a prison cell like that, I would be struggling to find any joy. But Paul is still rejoicing, and he's writing to the church and telling them to rejoice too. So what about the church? Well, it's a church in a Roman town. And we know that Paul is in a Roman prison. So they're probably not that keen on Christians. It may well be a church that has experienced subtle opposition. Maybe it's a place where being a Christian is not so straightforward. You might not get the job. You might be overlooked because you're associated with Christians, rather than actual out-and-out persecution. It's a place where there is conflict within the church, and Paul writes to the church and says, please sort out the conflict. It hurts me that you are fighting. It's a place, though, where Paul is full of love. He has many friends there, and he longs for this church to be united, for those who have fallen out with each other to become friends again and to be united once more. It's a place that he describes as his joy and his crown, as we had in the passage that was read. And as I've said, it's to be a Christian may not be straightforward, may not be easy within that town. To be part of the church and trying to live and work in that community may not be straightforward. However, the culture of that town is very much based upon a patronage system. So you have this system of gifts, and where somebody would help fund you and enable you to work, and then you are effectively tied in to being in relationship, like a not more than a business relationship, but where somebody buys you some say bakery equipment, and then you agree that as a baker now that you would bake not only just bread that you sell, but you would also provide your bread at a reduced rate to the person who has helped support you. And so actually this patronage system of gifts and mercy gifts and grace is kind of tied up in the whole Roman system, but actually within the church you find that it could work really well as a way of supporting each other and enabling each other. So you can develop stronger relationships within the church, and they can encourage and help and lift each other up. So to find that we have a church here in Philippians where there is conflict will be putting a strain on the very thing that can enable them to work together as a community, as a family that's closely knit together when other things might be working against them. And it is breaking Paul's heart. We discover in this passage he's pleading and he's pleading with two people. He takes the time to actually address two people individually in a public letter. This is how serious the conflict within the church is to Paul. And it is in this setting that Paul writes, just after he's addressed these two people and talked about their conflict and pleaded with them to resolve, he then says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Now, I hate conflict. I don't know what you are like with conflict, but I hate it. And when there is conflict, I find it really difficult to rejoice. But Paul is calling the church to rejoice. He himself is in a position which is horrible, and yet he rejoices. And he's calling a church which is facing stresses and conflict and things that are pressing in and pulling them outwards and pulling them apart, and yet he's saying, rejoice. There is a reason to rejoice, and the reason is in the Lord. So if rejoicing is so important in these difficult times for Paul, what is it that Paul is trying to say? How do you rejoice when you are in a dark and dangerous place, when you are in prison or when you are in conflict and your feelings have been hurt and you just find it hard to be nice to somebody else because you are hurting yourself? How do you rejoice? Always in those kind of settings. And the key is that your rejoicing is not based on an emotion. It's not a feeling. Feelings and emotion are like a wind. You can't really grab hold of them and hold on to them and keep them. They kind of come and go. They're easily knocked, easily lost. That sense of joy can be quickly replaced with a sense of sadness. Rather, Paul is making a conscious decision to rejoice. He is deciding that what he is going to do is he is going to focus on God, and he is going to rejoice in the Lord. He's not going to base his rejoicing on his feelings. He's not going to base his rejoicing on his circumstances. He is going to base it solely on the Lord. He is focusing on God. He's focusing on what Christ has done. He is focusing everything on that, which enables him in that place of great darkness, in that prison where his life is no longer in his hands. He has no say over what tomorrow will bring. That is all being left to other people with more authority and more power than he has. But he is basing his rejoicing on God, who has even more power than those who think they hold his life in their hands. And when we shift our focus off ourselves, off other people, off the circumstances we find ourselves in, and we shift our eyes up to God, and we look at all that Christ and God has done for us, then we can be thankful, and then we can truly rejoice. One of my favourite passages is actually from the book of Job, and it comes at the end of the book of Job, and it's kind of Job 38 and 39. And if you've read the book of Job, then you will know that Job goes through a terrible time in his life. And for those who haven't read the book of Job, it is a story of great suffering and loss and pain. But right at the end, God speaks to Job, and you hear God's voice. And he asks Job a question. I'm going to completely paraphrase what God is saying, because that he asks lots and lots, and he points out lots of things. But effectively what he's saying to Job is, well, where were you when I created earth? Who was it that decided that the sea stops here and doesn't cover all of the land? Where were you when the sun and the moon were decided? And do you know when the mountain goat gives birth, or or whether it should rain on the desert or not? Who makes all those kind of decisions? And God is pointing Job's eyes away from his circumstances and to who God is, and just how powerful God is, and all that God has overseen, and all that God is capable of, and all that God does do, and the complexities of who God is. We are surrounded by the works of God's hands. And if we stop and think that God sent his Son to die for us, that knowing all our wrongs, all our sins, all our guilt, all our shame would be placed upon Christ, that he would choose to die, and that God would raise him to life again, so that we can not only just know about God, but we can know God and be called his own. Just that in itself is overwhelming, to know that God the all-powerful would choose to do that for us. It causes rejoicing to rise within our hearts. And even if we stand and think, well, actually I've lived quite a good life, I haven't really done anything wrong, I've been all right, I've done my best. But have we really reached God's standards? Are there not times when we've decided to take God's place? When we decided that actually what God is doing is not quite good enough, but our decisions are much better, and we are more qualified to make a decision on this? Are we not stepping beyond our boundaries? Are we not then getting it a bit wrong? That even though we would question God, that we would challenge God, that we would dare to speak up, God still loves us and still chose to save us from ourselves quite often. Maybe you're thinking, but how have I questioned God's authority? I would never question God's authority. Don't put words into my mouth. I would never do that. Well, maybe we can accept that God has forgiven us, but we find it really hard to accept that we can forgive ourselves. We think that what we've done is too wrong, and so, yes, God has forgiven us, but I can't forgive myself. Are we saying that? What are we saying there? Are we saying that God has judged us wrong in forgiving us? Maybe we think that God, the all-powerful, can save everybody and anybody but me. Are we saying God isn't powerful enough to forgive our sins and to save us? Maybe we can accept that God can save us, but the world? Have you seen how corrupt it is, how polluted it is, how destroyed it is? God the all-powerful, but this problem is too immense. Is it for God? Maybe there's somebody we look at, somebody we love, and we just think they are too far gone. God could never save them from their drink, their drug, their lifestyle, the way they have chosen to go. It's just too much. Why even bother trying? Are we not in that statement, in those times, putting ourselves above God, in deciding who or what can be saved by God's almighty, powerful grace? So often things are impossible in our own strength. And when we stand there and we decide how things can or cannot be solved, we are in danger of deciding for God. But when we stop and we realise who God is and all that he has done and all that he is capable of and the love that he holds and the patience and his longing and his desire to rescue the very lost, then we have to rejoice, always. You see, you can buy hundreds of self-help books, you can go into a library or a bookshop, you can watch hundreds of videos as well on YouTube and various other places about how we could find happiness and the key to happiness and how you can even pursue happiness. There's a film on it, The Pursuit of Happiness, and how money or luxury or health and keep fits and diets and various other things we can do, but none of it quite achieves any of it. It just kind of keeps making us more and more stressed, this unachievable goal of trying to reach. But when we stop and we turn from looking at what we can achieve ourselves or what others can achieve for us, or trying to strive for things, and stop as Paul did in the prison and before he was in prison, and focus our eyes on God and all that Christ has done for us, then all that striving that we have done for ourselves is worthless. But instead we can say, oh, what joy fills my soul that Christ should come and die for me, that God should raise him again, and that I can be called a child of God. Oh, what joy can fill my heart. I can rejoice always when I stop and think of that. I can look around day or night and see the wonders of his creation, whether it's in the shape of a cloud going by, or the beauty of a night sky when it is cloudless. Maybe the rain falling on a dry ground, the grass, the trees, even within church, and the people around us. What joy that I can see when I focus on my Lord, that I, imperfect and flawed, am loved by him, that Christ would choose to die for me, for you. Why? Because. So I can choose in all circumstances then to rejoice in the Lord always. And I say again, rejoice.